multifaceted internal defense system that provides continual protection against evasion by foreign objects and protects against abnormal cells such as cancer. It is the immune system that paves the way for repair of damaged tissue. Pathogenic bacteria and viruses are the major targets of the immune system. The disease-producing capability of a pathogen is termed its virulence. Pathogenic bacteria produce disease primarily by releasing enzymes or toxins that do physical damage or produce a functional disruption in affected cells and organs. Viral pathogens are not self-sustaining cellular entities. They consist only of nucleic acids contained in a protein coat. These pathogens incorporate their nucleic acids into the host genome. They take over the host cell's biochemical facilities for their own use. This can lead to the body's immune system destroying the cell as it is no longer recognized as self. Viruses can also cause damage to the host by depleting the essential cell components, dictating that the cell produce substance toxic to the cell or transforming the cell into a cancer cell. Leukocytes spend most of their lives in the tissue rather than in the blood. Most leukocytes are produced from common precursor stem cells in the red bone marrow and are then released into the blood. Lymphocytes are produced by specialized lymphoid tissues. These tissues include lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, tonsils, adenoids, appendix, and the aggregates of lymphoid tissue in the lining of the digestive tract called Peyer's patches or gut-associated lymphoid tissue, otherwise known as gall. The thymus and bone marrow are important in processing T and B cells, respectively, to prepare them for their specific roles. Everyone is born with very similar innate immunity, which is a nonspecific response to foreign invasion or abnormal materials of any type, even on the first exposure to it. This is considered the first line of defense against a wide range of threats, including infectious agents, chemical irritants, and tissue injury from trauma and burns. Neutrophils and macrophages are especially important in innate defense. Generic molecular patterns set the innate defenses into motion. These patterns are exogenous pathogen-associated molecular patterns and endogenous damage-associated molecular patterns. These patterns are recognized by specialized plasma membrane proteins on the responding cells called toll-like receptors. There are at least a dozen different TLRs that recognize specific cells. Innate defense include inflammation, interferons, natural killer cells, and the complement system. Inflammation is an underlying culprit in many common chronic illnesses. Inflammation brings phagocytes and plasma proteins to the invaded or injured area. The inflammatory response is similar no matter what initiates the action. For example, in response to a bacterial invasion of tissue, the resident macrophages immediately begin phagocytizing the foreign microbes. The macrophages will secrete chemotaxins and cytokines. Most mast cells in the area being invaded release histamine, which causes local arterioles to dilate, which allows more blood into the tissue, bringing more immune components into the area. The histamine also causes capillaries to become very leaky, resulting in increased interstitial fluid volume, otherwise known as edema. The increased blood flow and edema resulted in elevation of local temperature and swelling. Pain is caused by tissue distension and by chemicals interacting with receptor endings of local afferent neurons. These areas can be walled off as fibrin leaks from the blood into the interstitial fluid, forming clots into spaces around the invading organisms and damaged cells to prevent them from migrating out of the area. Fast-moving neutrophils arrive within an hour, while slower monocytes may not arrive for 12 hours. Fever is a common result of inflammation. While a mild fever is beneficial in this immune response, extremely high fevers can be detrimental, especially to the nervous system. Natural killer cells are naturally occurring lymphocyte-like cells that destroy virus-infected cells and cancer cells on first exposure to them by mechanisms that are largely unknown. Adaptive immune responses include antibody-mediated or humoral immunity involving production of antibodies by B lymphocyte derivatives called plasma cells, and cell-mediated immunity involving production of activated T lymphocytes which directly attack the unwanted cells. B cells and T cells recognize cells that are distinct from the body's own normal cells by the presence of antigens expressed by the unwanted cells. The antigen to which B cells respond can be T-independent or T-dependent. Each B and T cell have receptors, B cell receptors and T cell receptors. These receptors are specific for only one specific type of antigen. B cells can bind with and produce antibodies against polysaccharide antigens without any assistance from T cells. T-independent antigens. For B cells to produce antibodies against most protein antigens, they need assistance from a special type of T cell called the T helper cell, T-dependent antigen. Antigens stimulate B cells to convert into plasma cells that produce antibodies or immunoglobulins. Antibodies are classified into 5 subclasses based on differences in their biological activities. Antibodies are Y-shaped and classified according to properties of their tail portion. The tail region is called the constant region and determines the functional properties of the antibody. There are 2 identical antigen binding sites at the tips of each arm. Antigen binding fragments. Antibodies function by producing 2 actions. Neutralization, where antibodies combine with toxins of certain viruses to prevent them from affecting susceptible cells, and agglutination, where multiple antibodies cross-link numerous antigens into chains or lattices of antigen-antibody complexes. This leads to clumping of targeted cells and precipitation of targeted toxins. Active immunity is self-generated by the individual's immune system when exposed to antigens. Passive immunity is borrowed, as antibodies formed by another individual are introduced into the body. This happens from mother to infant and when antibodies are injected into the bloodstream of an individual. The huge rapport of B cells is built by reshuffling a small set of gene fragments. T cells defend against covert invaders that hide inside cells where antibodies and the complement system cannot reach them. T cells respond only to antigens presented to them by antigen-presenting cells. T cells cannot perform their duties without the assistance of antigen-presenting cells, such as macrophages or dendritic cells, especially abundant in skin and mucosal linings of lungs and digestive system. After exposure to the appropriate antigen, dendritic cells migrate to the lymph nodes, where they cluster and activate the T cells. Immune diseases result from insufficient immune responses, allergies, or inappropriate immune attacks against harmless environmental substances. The skin consists of an outer protective epidermis and an inner connective tissue dermis. Specialized cells in the epidermis produce keratin and melanin and participates in immune defense. Protective measures within body cavities discourage pathogen invasion into the body.